Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the latest episode of Sinocism Live. We have a great conversation today with three experts who've just written a terrific new paper for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's called China's Foreign Police Training: A Global Footprint, and it really looks at how China has it's been doing this outreach with its various security services, police forces, to train up foreign country security services, and how it really is, I think, a plank in the global security initiatives. So, love to first introduce the guests. We have Sheena Chestnut-Greetens, Isaac Carden, and Cameron Waltz. And, I want to thank you for taking the time. I hope we have about an hour for this discussion, but also thank you for this paper because it's clearly a really important topic that I think has maybe not gotten enough attention. So I will turn it over to you and just let me know why did you write this paper and what should we really be focused on?
So I guess I'll jump in and start us off. We wrote this paper because we were looking at China's global security footprint, and it struck me, having looked at the internal security apparatus and its role in Chinese domestic politics and domestic security for a while, that we were increasingly seeing those actors play a foreign policy role and a role in shaping China's external security behavior. And Isaac and I had worked on a paper that looks at places where the Chinese internal security apparatus is providing training and support and diplomatic engagement to certain countries like Vietnam or the United Arab Emirates, even though the US DoD and the US military is involved in providing security assistance on the military side. And that just struck us as a really interesting new dynamic in the global security environment. But a lot of that's driven by this expanded Chinese global security footprint. So we started looking at this. We did an earlier report that looked at the diplomatic outreach and the diplomatic frameworks that China is using to try to build out its interactions with the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of State Security, the Central Political Legal Commission. But we realized that police training is really one of the most concrete lines of effort. Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders have committed to training thousands of foreign police officers in close to a half dozen different high-profile public appearances, from Xi Jinping's engagement with Interpol to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other international organizations. And so we just got really interested in the police training part of this, and then spent the better part of a year building a data set that formed the backbone of this report. And we should let Cameron talk about that because he knows the data inside and out and has all sorts of cool examples at his fingertips.
Yep. Cameron, if you want to jump in on some of the details, that's great. I was going to
if we want to get straight to
put
top
in a broader
lines,
context, but go ahead.
So I guess what we originally envisioned going in, there had been at least one other report by Jordan Link at the Center for American Progress, who had been able to touch on the aspect of China's foreign police training. And at the outset, we were maybe expecting to only find maybe a couple hundred trainings. I believe that Link was able to find between 150 and 200. But we ended up finding well over 800 trainings. I think the exact number is 863, and touching around 138 countries across the world. And what we expected to be maybe a training enterprise that started perhaps in the late 2010s, extended all the way back to 2000. And what was originally training for China's near neighbors, focusing on counter-narcotics in Southeast Asia, basic capacity building for Mongolia and Central Asian neighbors, really expanded radically in the 2010s, as soon sort of correlating with Xi Jinping's direction of the public security or the Ministry of Public Security towards overseas engagement. And so just as, we had our first PRC national chief of Interpol, we were also seeing, almost 100 trainings a year towards the end of the 2010s. And these were touching international organizations. They were being funneled through Interpol, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Lansang Mekong Cooperation, and we're also being conducted on bilateral bases. Still to this day, the primary contacts are countries that directly border China. The modes of our data set, with I believe 63 participations is Myanmar, followed closely by Vietnam, Laos, Kazakhstan. But even then, we saw certain particular examples where, we see a country of 100 million people like Vietnam, where maybe we have 50 times that Vietnamese police have participated in Chinese police training. But we also see small population countries like the Solomon Islands, which has had a repeated string of in-country liaisons and attachés that have been basically training and assisting Solomon Islands police forces for nonstop for the past 3 years. And so we ended up tracking, in addition to the breadth of these trainings, we tracked a number of the contents that I'd be happy to get into later. But we were really struck by just how widespread this touched. We found around, our lowest end estimate is that 20,000 foreign police officers got training in China. But based on pretty strong confidence from us, we think the number might be, easily double that.
And we say in China, meaning they actually went to China for this training?
Around 90% of them went to China. So in rare instances, China would go abroad and train, but around 90% of them were at major national and provincial police academies. So our most common repeat offender was Shandong Police College, Yunnan Police College, Criminal Investigation Police University of China. In addition to these national police universities, we also even had purpose-built foreign police training bases or centers, focused on specific regional groupings. So there's one being constructed right now in Fujian province at Fujian Police College in Fuzhou. That's going to specifically serve Pacific Islands countries. Yunnan Police College has a specific center for ASEAN and for the Lancang Mekong cooperation. There's one that was constructed in the 2000s in Xinjiang that specifically serves Central Asia. So there's a pretty widespread national enterprise that's been distributed amongst a number of actors for training in China.
Any reason for Shandong? Just curious.
Not that we can. I guess our best guess, and my best guess, is that they just happen to be the most open about it. We can tell that they've maybe reported around 75% of their trainings, whereas other actors that we know to be quite prominent have reported far fewer. So we can report the numbers that we can find,
right.
But in terms of estimates, I'd say that Criminal Investigation Police University of China, University of Public Security, like these major national universities of primary trainers.
I actually have a hunch that Shandong as a province is especially entrepreneurial in this kind of international liaison space. I remember in a totally separate project looking at China-Pakistan relations and a lot of the economic projects surrounding the Port of Gwadar and the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and Shandong kind of provincial level and local SOEs were very, very prevalent there, all up and down. There's a lot of oil industry in Karachi, also all Shandong folks. And I was told by numbers of Chinese that it's just because the Shandong folks are tougher. I'm sure cool or something. Like they're into going to Pakistan, and they're into like police brutality, and they're into all that rough, rugged stuff.
But I think this is a point worth noting. All of the numbers we're giving are the floor. The real numbers we know are higher than that, because in a number of cases we can see a police college will say, oh, we did 57 trainings and we can confirm 17. So we know there are another 40 that we can't find. And that gives us some sense of the upper bound that we might be looking at if we actually could do all the math.
There's also these astronomical top line figures cited by senior personages, including Xi Jinping, Wang Xiaohang, who heads the Ministry of Public Security, about how many foreign officers they're going to train in Africa, or how many are going to train through various programs. And Cameron, maybe you can attest exactly what the delta is there, but we're obviously not able to observe everything. They're also likely to exaggerate and to set unrealistic goals, but there's a lot that we can observe. And part of what we want to accomplish here in this very extensive open source research that Cameron really deserves the majority of the credit for is that there's way more out there. If you talk to the Solomon Islands, you'd probably learn a lot about the substance of these trainings if they were willing to share it with you.
Right. I mean, are you finding, like a lot of research has been finding, that as you start pulling this information and talking about it, then you start seeing that the sources go dark and that they try and pull stuff offline?
I will say as we went through and did a lot of this, we learned from some of our early efforts to collect the data that we needed to archive everything the minute we saw it. And so The sources that we have in the data set have now been archived so that we won't lose them, and people can go verify that they did in fact exist on the internet and have been preserved. So yes, we did find that sources disappeared. How much of that is just due to sort of weird website maintenance at random police colleges, and how much of it's due to political sensitivity, I don't know. We did find in some cases, in particular, some of the discussion in police journals, that there were cases where the people doing the training were told either to screen participants in advance based on how they might react to kind of either counterintelligence or political sensitivity of the training, or in some cases to maybe it's suggesting that they sign confidentiality or non-disclosure agreements because the contents of the training seemed normal to the Chinese instructors, but might be politically sensitive or uncomfortable to the people receiving the training. And so it would just be best if you had them sign non-disclosure agreements, was kind of the gist of the article, one of the articles we read. And so we think there's at least, that's one reason why some of this has gotten harder to track, because one of the other things that jumps out in reading the Chinese police discussion, particularly among police colleges, is that a huge motivation for them to participate in this training is to fix what they see as a really negative image, soft power image of the Chinese internal security apparatus and the Chinese police. And so they see providing police training as an image assist, basically. But that only works if you present a very positive, rosy view of Chinese policing and its contributions. And so part of the purpose, at least as it's expressed by the Chinese police instructors themselves, is to help fix an image problem that the Chinese police think they have abroad.
Interesting. And I guess that, so and then the countries they're working with tend not to be sort of what the Chinese would call the US-led Western countries, right? It's more of the global South. Is that fair to say?
By and large, we do have isolated cases where, you'll see countries, there are some Western democracies in the map, in the data set. Australia is in there. I got asked the other day about Australia. Often what that is a police liaison training course. So somebody who might be from a law enforcement agency in Europe or somewhere like Australia going in and doing language training to better interface with Chinese police and law enforcement in a professional or diplomatic capacity. And so that's a little bit different than some of the other types of training. In general, the training is actually pretty heterogeneous. There's a lot of variety. But to the extent that, that tends to be the Western democracies or the US allies and partners, to the extent that they're getting training, it's that sort of more language specific liaison role, not really training in tactics or capacity building or counterterrorism, which is what we're seeing among much bigger chunks of the training in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Africa, and the Pacific Islands.
So one question, just, we're talking about China and what they're doing, but just to sort of level set, the U.S. does some of this too, right? And some other large countries do also train foreign police forces. What's different, if there is a difference?
Yeah, so the United States has international law enforcement academies that train in different parts of the world. And the United States has been doing that for a while. The United States programs are generally a bit more limited in both scope and in terms of the criteria for participation. So the United States is legally prohibited from providing certain forms of security assistance and training to countries with poor human rights records or democratic records. And so we haven't done a sort of perfect side-by-side comparison, especially over the same time period, to see how participants compare to the countries that the U.S. might have offered law enforcement capacity building to. But you're right, China is certainly not the only game in town. I think what we hadn't, appreciated prior to doing this is just how much China was providing this training to how many countries and kind of really how diverse the number of institutions and programs inside the PRC had become. And so as the activity has ramped up during Xi Jinping's tenure, we felt like it was good to just lay down an empirical baseline. It would be great to do a side-by-side comparison with the US and other actors that do law enforcement
next
capacity
project.
building in a future project. We had to get this piece done first.
Right. No, I was just curious because I know we do some, but again, it's not something that I'm particularly familiar with, but I think it's, I mean, there's sort of similarities, but then of course there are sort of China specific differences.
Yeah. And this comparison is actually really fundamental to what launched us on this track of research to begin with. And the original terms for it was, it looks like the U.S. primarily focuses on regional security. When we think about its bilateral and multilateral security relationships, often defensive alliances, that's the focus, regional security, and DoD is the lead agency by and large, and has to do with, work interoperability, selling weapons, defending the Persian Gulf or something like that. Whereas China, when they think about security, domestically, as Sheena will attest, but internationally as well, regime security is much closer to the mark. And so the lead agencies that we were watching conducting China's security diplomacy are their Ministry of Public Security, the MSS, in some cases, the political legal, Xitong. It's a whole different set of goals, and it's nested in China's comprehensive national security strategy. And so the comparison is really instructive. There's some overlap. And in our very academic work, we even include a Venn diagram to help with this intuition. Like China and the U.S. do a lot of the same stuff. China does sell weapons. China doesn't. They're not really in the mutual defense treaty business. North Korea is an asterisk at best in that regard. But there are some specialized, differentiated things that the U.S. does on that very high end of regional security and defense alliances, and there are some things in the middle that we both do. And then there's some things that really uniquely China does, because as Sheena says, we're legally constrained from it. And I think also just politically inhibited from doing it, because it's something we don't have the nerve for it. Maybe we used to do it in the Cold War, but right now it's not something that's happening out in the open. And I guess just while I'm going on this comparison point, and this overlap in the Venn diagram, I think counterterrorism is the one that's most interesting to me, and it's probably the widest aperture for thinking about how will this affect national security practices in other countries, because ultimately that's one of the questions that we're wrestling with. We're sitting here, I'm sitting here in Washington, Bill, you're in DC too. Counterterrorism can be a very capacious category. America designated a variety of groups as terrorists and created a permission structure globally in a security sense for people to do counter-terror operations against a lot of groups that may or may not have properly belonged in that category. And
we're doing it now with the
don't get me started
drugs. I know, different discussion, right? But
let's do that.
Your point is well taken. Your point is well taken.
But when China shows up, they're pretty agnostic about who's a terrorist and who's not. From the standpoint of many authoritarians, it's your political opposition. And if you can designate them a terrorist, you can use military rather than law enforcement type tactics, or you can use very repressive security tactics, which I think is what China offers. And it's it's a very attractive offering in a global marketplace where the US doesn't really serve that market segment, just to extend that market analogy a little bit.
If I could just chime in one last thing about the substantial differences between the kinds of training that the West offers and the kinds that China offers. I think importantly, as Isaac alluded to in the counterterrorism discussion, the kinds of categorical topics we see in these trainings are quite distinct. Like in the United States, like most American security systems, whether it be military or internal security, usually comes with strings attached of certain conditions of trying to instill certain kinds of ethics in law enforcement, of not providing law enforcement assistance to countries that work with records of human rights abuses. But in China's case, there's a pretty wide variety of kinds of contents of these trainings that are typically tailored to the individual conditions on the ground that political leadership want to work with. So we see a specific subset of training about criminal enforcement and crime, trying to target counter narcotics, or trying to target, let's say, there's like a substantial subset targeting online scams that's going to Southeast Asia, where it's well known that there's a large proliferation of overseas Chinese networks of criminal groups that are doing online scams. We also see public order and regime security training. So in certain cases, we see China offering to, let's say, the president of the Central African Republic, we will do a multi-month training of your elite armed guard to protect you. And so, there's a big mix of these things that we would consider to be traditional law enforcement purviews, such as capacity building and just trying to enforce crime, but also, these public order ones, these ones to do with riot control. There's some that implicitly connect towards BRI projects. So towards Central Asia and Southeast Asia, there's been pipeline protection, railroad protection, infrastructure protection. And the actual link to Chinese infrastructure projects is never really laid out, but it's strongly implied that it's about protecting the projects that China is helping to build. And so it's not just a difference between who is trained between China and the United States, but also a difference in what is trained and why it is trained and what specific ends it serves.
Thank you. So a couple of questions come out of that. The first question, more high level, is who is the coordinating body in the PRC system? Is it the Political and Legal Affairs Commission? Is it coming at the whose head Chou Wen-ching now sits on the Politburo? Is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs involved at all? Are they more tangential? How is this coordinated? Do you have any sense?
That's a great question. And we don't have a terrific answer. One of the things that's been fascinating in talking to Chinese interlocutors about the Global Security Initiative and looking at the Chinese writings, academic and academic adjacent in China, is that there is no real sort of central coordinating office or person that is publicly named to be quarterbacking a lot of this. So a lot of the police training has been kind of subsumed under the Global Security Initiative. Some of it predated the Global Security Initiative, but the Global Security Initiative has become the framework that systematizes and lays out more strategically how these old lines of activity get built up, enhanced, and then blended with new mechanisms and new projects to form the Global Security Initiative. But what's really interesting about this is it doesn't actually appear to be terribly coordinated. And so, for example, if you try to ask a follow-up question about the 5,000 police officers that Xi Jinping promised to train at X speech that he made, there is no public, at least, repository or list of how that commitment has been fulfilled. And some of these commitments are now several years old. So the speeches at the Global Public Security Cooperation Forum, where Wang Xiaohong, the Minister of Public Security, made commitments to train thousands of police officers. The Ministry of Public Security does not keep a record and has released no information on the implementation or the follow-through of these high-profile commitments. And we actually found that really interesting and a little bit puzzling, because this is a number that the leadership has publicly committed to. And so I would have expected a little more information on the follow-up and a little bit of sort of explanation of the math later. But there's very, very little. And the training programs, as Cameron mentioned, there are over 50 different institutions inside the PRC that have been involved in this training, which even if you had a central person trying to keep track of each of these training programs would be a fairly complicated spreadsheet to assemble. And it's not actually clear to me who or how this is being tracked or aggregated at a very high level. I would find it surprising if no one has done that somewhere in the system. But it is not visible from the outside, which I find kind of fascinating given the seniority of the people who have put these numbers out in public.
I mean, maybe it's the sort of kind of, I think still not really well understood because it's so opaque that their National Security Commission probably maybe is involved. Did you find any numbers about budgets? Like how much is the PRC spending on this? Because it's one of those questions where on the one hand, you can see why it makes sense from a sort of a geopolitical perspective. On the other hand, if they're spending a lot of money, there might be some Chinese citizens who aren't particularly happy about it because they would rather that money be spent domestically.
I mean, I have a project right now that should be coming out in the next couple of months that actually tracks the overall Chinese public security and domestic security budget for the last 30 years.
Oh boy, that'll be great.
And looks at that at the provincial level as well as the national level. And one of the things that you see is over the course, this doesn't directly answer your question, but I'll give a little bit of context around the scale of the funding. So the internal security budget basically doubled between 2012 and 2022. It actually rose almost in parallel with the published military budget. And just like the military budget, where there are these extra budgetary expenditures that could add little or a lot, depending on which ones you count, to the total spending, the same is true of the domestic security budget. For example, the Ministry of State Security is not included, and we have to assume, given the visibility of some of its operations and the role that it's played, that costs the PRC something. But what's interesting is that it rose basically in proportion to spending. So it's still around 5.3% of the total national expenditure for the PRC. But the Ministry of Public Security has over time picked up a bigger and bigger share of this budget. What we don't know is how much of that is being directed toward these kinds of global outreach activities, in part because some of them are done at the provincial level. And so you'd actually have to get in and try to disaggregate Shandong's provincial budget and look at the funding for Shandong Police College, and then figure out how much of it was going to things that were inside Shandong versus these foreign training activities. It would be great to get that granular in the data, but we have some costs for individual projects that we've seen, but nothing systematic.
Given that lack of granularity, to back it up a little bit and think about these, whether it's the Global Security Initiative, whether it's police training that's now described as being nested in that. Bill, you and your China watching audience will be very familiar with what we've been calling kind of a mobilizational style, policy style. You can see this very much in the security space, where it's centrally directed. There's some slogans, and the BRI now is the most recognizable one, and this is obviously a kind of this is a sequel to that, but it's the same style of policy making. It has to do with some very specific figures set at the top. Obviously, great deal of central leadership investment in their personal attention. Xi Jinping has been he's been the brand of all of these things very deliberately. But then the implementation phase, like lots of things, can be very kind of improvisational and chaotic. And I think that explains a lot of the stuff that we see in provincial police colleges and other actors kind of jockeying to help define what is it that China is doing. The one thing they know for sure is that it's nested in the comprehensive national security concept, right? And that's Xi Jinping's core contribution, and it does not stop at the water's edge or the border for China by any stretch of the imagination. It's not conceived that way. And if we think it is, we're mirror imaging an American construct that's not correct. And that's actually part of the motivation. And I think one of the key things that we're hoping to offer people is, like, China is a big security actor now at a global level. It just doesn't look like us, and we're not tracking it exactly right.
And I mean, one of the things that they've been talking about a lot more in the last several years, right, is this idea of development interests, which I think is a extremely expansive global concept. And so I'm guessing that then this fits in with that idea of protecting their development interests, right? It's part of, you have a military component, but then I think this probably would also fit as sort of a more of a on the ground security perspective. So one question, and I'm reading from the introduction to your paper that you published with Carnegie, is really would love to sort of dig into what this means by this one sentence here, where you wrote, foreign police training programs also help embed new Chinese-led standards of security cooperation and policing tools into the practices of domestic security forces around the world. And in doing so, such activities bolster China's narrative about what security is in today's world and who is best at providing it. And so I guess part of that is this Global Security Initiative, which is, I think, the first of their new four initiatives: the Development Initiative, the Civilization Initiative, and is it the second? It was GDI first? Okay, second, Global Civilization Initiative, and now the Global Governance Initiative. Right. But what does that mean in terms of Chinese standards, and where does industry fit in? Because I know there was is there the annual big police tools, security tools conference, right? And I mean, it seems like the Chinese are producing all sorts of security related gear and technology that, including some pretty large companies, well-known companies. Where do they fit in all this?
Yeah, so a couple of great questions there. The place I would look when we talk about starting to embed Chinese security standards about what security is and how to provide it into foreign police forces is the training, but also in the event that we mentioned in our first report on security diplomacy, which is called the Global Public Security Cooperation Forum, Lianyungang. It's held every year in Jiangsu. It's actually the biggest PRC hosted global security convening that is happening. It's bigger than the Xiangshan Forum, even though Americans tend to pay more attention to that one, which is hosted by the Defense Ministry. And so, and Lianyungang has really exploded from its sort of rebrand, relaunch post-COVID from 2022 to 2024. The expansion in the number of countries that sent official participants was huge. So I think we're up to 110 or 115. I'd have to look back to get the exact numbers for each year. Countries participating in the Global Public Security Cooperation Forum. And one of the things they do is have these sub-forums, and Cameron can talk about some of this as well, that do a lot of standard setting. They pull working groups together to try to come up with standards around the use of AI technology in policing, or police practices, best practices for counter-narcotics cooperation in the contemporary environment, or border security, which is something that China works on with a lot of its neighbors and does concrete police training on as well. And probably one of the, to me, most fascinating exercises in standard setting is something that the Global Public Security Cooperation Forum came up with and produced a sort of pilot version of last year, which was a global public security index that ranked countries according to how they performed in public security. And surprise, surprise, China was the safest country in the ranking.
Yes.
And the United States was the worst. I think it was a 69 versus an 86 or something like that. But it also leaves China some room to improve, right? Even on its own index. And the UAE, which has the UAE Interior Minister is the head of Interpol and has really sort of thrown his weight behind this particular forum and put Interpol's backing behind it. So the UAE also performs quite well in this index. But to me, that's a real exercise in resetting the normative conversation that, for a while at the UN, if you think about conversations on Xinjiang or Tibet or human rights, were quite critical of China on normative grounds about how it handled internal security. And so what you see is, I think, an attempt to really reframe the narrative and say, actually, China's good at providing public safety for its citizens. And the United States, which has high rates of violent crime and problems with guns and these issues with fentanyl, is really terrible at providing public safety for its own citizens. That's security too. And China's really good at providing that. We have an example we can share with you, whether it's the Fengqiao model or sort of a more disaggregated set of tools. And the Global Public Security Cooperation Forum now has a tech expo where Chinese tech companies sell the tools that are then used to implement these standards, and that are also correlated with police training. So we found a bunch of trainings where technology companies would come in and brief about how their technology platforms could be used to improve police performance. Cameron, you've looked at this a lot, both the Global Public Security Cooperation Forum and the Tech Expo component of this. What did I forget? There's a lot more to say here.
I'd say that, so at least at the abstract international level, there's also cooperation documents that are signed at these sub-forums. They typically tend to invite not only national actors, but industry experts from foreign countries, sub-national actors who are actively involved in using big data and police work and implementing AI in law enforcement, piloting drones for law enforcement work. So these things do tend to matter at the abstract international level, but even in terms of the grassroots trainings, there's certain examples of where, we can do it, that there's sort of a transfer of norms or an interlinking of these, sort of basic training on, let's say, city surveillance with, look at the system from Huawei or Maya Pico, that is a phone scanning system.
Alibaba don't they have the City Brain system or something? Or is that Huawei?
Yeah, exactly. And so, there's a specific, we even managed to obtain a PowerPoint from a professor at People's Public Security University of China, which actually didn't even make it into the report, but the PowerPoint shows sort of these elaborate diagrams of these interlinked, systematized, informatized models of policing software that China also sells. So it's partially, we'll teach you, how to do this basic law enforcement function, but also look at this fun tech platform we have. And then even more so, like let's say what norms are being spread when you learn riot tactics from China? What norms are being spread when you learn how to do counterterrorism work from China? And so even though these effects might be diffuse on the grassroots level, there really is a specific intention in terms of the content of the trainings, as far as we can see them, to really try and sell that China's model of law enforcement and public security is the most effective, will make things the most safe, and will achieve the specific political ends of public security that you want, whether those be having stronger administration of far off sort of peripheral provinces, or if you want to have stronger control of public actions that may be demonstrating against your regime.
Let me piggyback on that quickly with a PSA and tapping back to the point Cameron made earlier. Archive your sources. You have a lot of sophisticated China watchers. .cn sources especially, but probably everything, because they're not stable and you can lose it and stuff gets burned. So, hopefully Cameron didn't just burn our People's Public Security University PowerPoint. Just only
that
kind
one's
of.
archived, don't even
I mean, there's
worry.
nothing. We obviously want to use these sources and publish on them while we still can, but it's again, PSA, archive your sources.
Yeah. Sounds like a great PowerPoint. Love to see it.
And I guess while I'm on that and turning back to you, just a pitch for this being Carnegie's Asia program here in DC. Cameron was working as the heart and soul of it, and Sheena as non-res, who is really keeps the lights on here. And, we get to do work like this still in this environment. And it's nice that people are interested in it. The government seems to be distracted.
But this whole idea of this kind of shifting the norms, I mean, the way they're changing the conversation, I mean, one, it sounds like it's pretty smart from China. It seems like it's sort of a win-win-win, because it allows them to shift the norms. It allows them to build relationships with sort of the hard power components of governments around the world. And also, I assume they can make money. I mean, there is a budget. They have to spend money to bring over these foreign, train these foreign police officers. But it sounds like from the sort of the China security industrial complex, some of these companies are probably starting to make pretty good money. And when it comes to technology, when it comes to the sort of the policing technology, I mean, China's a good lower cost provider than, say, the US, right?
Yeah, it's lower cost, and there is some evidence that there was this real push to expand the use of security technology by local PSBs and at the subnational level in China, and that as that market got saturated and those contracts got fulfilled, that some of these tech companies, in order to keep making a profit, had to start looking at foreign markets, and so in some ways this is a little bit of like the Chinese security apparatus helping keep companies viable that it's going to need to reprocure technology from and wants the support of domestically, but it's not going to have the same huge contract more than every 5 years or something, right? This technology has a certain shelf life, but you're not necessarily buying the same thing every year. And so that's one thing that I think is really interesting. It does seem to provide market opportunities for Chinese companies. But it is also just a really, I think, important form of global outreach. We actually I have an old data set that looks at pre-COVID export of surveillance and safe city technology. But a lot has happened in the last 5 years, and the companies involved have changed a little bit. So we'd actually like to update and expand that into another data set to get at this question of what the tech companies' roles are. That's kind of next up on the to-do list.
But again, it also just seems like if you're able to effectively wire both sort of actually literally wire with the technology, but also with people who you've trained. And I mean, I think we did this, some of the US did some of this in the Cold War. I mean, ultimately, it also, the systems that they're putting in are probably systems that they can access remotely, right? So it also gives you potentially a fairly useful edge into having an insight into what's going on in certain countries that maybe they don't want you to know. Is that a fair guess?
I think
You're saying the
that's a
quiet part
fair
out loud,
question to
Bill.
raise. I don't know how much we were able to show concretely that's happening.
Right.
But one of the things that's interesting, right, in the process of negotiating this contract, and it often happens with the Ministry of Public Security's help, the Chinese tech companies get really good granular information on how those countries see their internal security environment and their security challenges. And that has some real intelligence benefits for the PRC. And if your goal is protecting overseas Chinese interests, that's a really good way to get a sense of what might threaten those interests and how, and therefore what you need to do to protect them. But I guess the one thing I want to emphasize, because I think this is why it's a really thorny policy challenge for the United States and for the international community, is that China is in some cases providing a global public good that the United States or other countries aren't always available, willing, and able to provide, and definitely can't do on a time frame as fast as China can. And so in some cases, Chinese companies and the Chinese public security apparatus is filling an actual need in a country that needs better law enforcement capacity.
And better
problem is that it
security
comes with this extra layer of stuff that you really can't just sort of easily firewall off. And so you're building coercive capacity that, depending on the recipient country, could be used for purposes that are subject to democratic oversight and constraint, in which case, not as worried, or could be turned fairly quickly toward an autocratic and repressive capacity. The US got out of the internal security game during the Cold War, the internal security assistance game, in part because it backfired on the United States so many times to provide repressive capacity to autocrats. So there's a really interesting sort of moral hazard and long-term strategic question about the extent to which this will sort of serve Chinese interests, but also a really thorny policy challenge to the United States about when and how do you want to compete, or how do you want to shape the use of this capacity as China builds it globally.
And you can't just lecture these countries, oh, you shouldn't do it because human rights, when they have real needs for social, for security and public safety.
It's an interesting redux of, I'd say, the failed diplomacy surrounding, say, the Belt and Road. You talked about the win-win or win-win-win solution. If the U.S. is actually not going to serve that market,
right,
it's very difficult to be just like, don't take it, don't buy this tech stack, don't take this police training. We're constrained by the Leahy Amendment, and we think you're an autocrat, but don't take it from China. It's an unprotected segment. It is security. And just to make an even finer point on something Sheena just said, not only do these private firms and Chinese diplomats and the Chinese government get exquisite intelligence on their partners by virtue of deploying these technologies and having these intimate relationships, they see and understand and probably are empathize with, in a way that it's hard for us to do here in the US, with their national security priorities, which are probably more like Xi Jinping's in a lot of the cases that we're looking at, where regime security, your mortal threats from your domestic opponents, which we're starting to recognize here in the United States as being characteristic of certain types of regimes, right? That's actually most countries' idea of what national security is. The United States is quite extraordinary and unusual in thinking about regional security. That's a great power prerogative. And what China's doing is really segmenting this market. They do it bilaterally primarily. We've mentioned a lot of these multilateral settings, but as in BRI, as in much of their substantive diplomacy, and I'm sure in the private sector too, it's very bilateral. It's very ad hoc. It's very difficult for the U.S. to, from a policy standpoint, as Sheena's pointing out, to stand in the way of it, because we're standing in the way of some very legitimate public security goods that we don't provide, or that we so far are unable or unwilling.
And do other countries try to provide this? Japan or any of the countries in the EU provide this, or just not really?
Sometimes it depends a lot on the region. So for example, in the Pacific Islands, Australia has traditionally been a pretty strong, capable security provider in the region. There are still questions in some cases about whether China will provide certain tools that either Australia won't, or sometimes it's simply a matter of time frame. So if China can get something to a Pacific Islands subnational official fast before an election, then that might be preferable to demonstrate to constituents that you're doing something, or to give you the capacity to handle electoral violence, which has been an issue in a couple of those countries. And so sometimes it's even in places where there is another provider, The issue has to do with speed and scale, and whether or not those offerings are competitive. So it's a tough question.
And have we seen that happen in the Pacific Islands?
Seen what?
Seen sort of the Chinese are able to get support to, say, a subnational leader or faster than, say, the Australians?
Anecdotally, I've heard about that in conversation, and there are cases where countries have been in the process of considering certain security deals, and at least from, again, I'm going by public reporting here, the Australian government has either stepped up or accelerated an offer in order to try to ensure that that a Chinese pact doesn't necessarily go through. Now, that's had mixed success. In some cases, Australia's been able to extend security commitments, and in some cases, that has not necessarily negated China's offers of assistance, right? Why would you only have one partner or supporter if you can get two, right? From the perspective of a recipient state, that logic makes some sense. But in other cases, recipient countries do have concerns about either the vulnerabilities or the particularly some of the data ownership and data security provisions that come with Chinese, for certain types of Chinese police assistance, particularly the more tech and data driven ones. So it's really a mixed bag in terms of what a lot of this is just very case by case in terms of who's able to provide what, when, and then kind of how countries triangulate between different offers.
And I will guess the Chinese offers come with fewer strings attached, at least directly, or at least around rights issues. Is that a fair statement?
I don't think that's a part of any Chinese contract or diplomatic negotiation that I've ever seen.
Okay. So I want to ask, you mentioned earlier this Fengqiao experience concept, which I just a quick overview, but you can correct me. I mean, it started in the Mao era, and it was very kind of at the time a fairly nasty kind of class war sort of approach to policing, where you had sort of people effectively a lot of denunciation, a lot of watching, and sort of trying to manage social contradictions and class contradictions at the grassroots level. Xi Jinping loves it. He started pushing it, I think, back in Zhejiang like 20 years ago, or maybe in Fujian. I might be getting confused. It has now been sort of reworked for the Xi era, for this new era, and it seems like it's a grassroots kind of concept for policing that involves mediation. It involves a lot of segmenting out populations and figuring out different types of people or populations that may be at risk of bad behavior for certain reasons. It does seem to involve a lot of technology, kind of a panopticon approach in some ways. I think it fits maybe with the grid management system. But there was an article Reuters did a couple months ago that said that the Solomon Islands, at least one of the islands or one of the provinces, was being trained up on the Fengqiao experience, which seemed, especially if you're in Canberra in Australia, I think you would probably find that a little concerning. Do you have what is going on there?
So I think what's interesting about that case is that for a while there has been this debate about the export of Chinese surveillance technology. And so if you look at like the foreign affairs piece by Min Chin Pei, or you look at some of the work by Jessica Chen Weiss, they're very skeptical that Chinese surveillance technology, if exported, will actually be all that effective, because it is usually tied to this sort of Leninist political model. Now, in some of the work I've done, it looks like actually if you export Chinese surveillance technology into another autocracy, it's still pretty good at doing what it was designed to do in the first place. Doesn't necessarily have the same effects in democracies. But what's interesting about the Fengqiao model and what's happening in the Solomon Islands is that this is explicitly training on a model of grassroots social control that is political and organizational. It is not just technology, and it is not just police tactics. It's actually a sort of much broader political model of social control. And that's, I think you described the Fengqiao model pretty accurately. When Chinese sources talk about it, and when Xi Jinping started talking about it, part of what's appealing about it is that it contains potential sources of instability, so that small things don't leave the village, big things don't leave the province, or I forget exactly what the saying is that gets repeated a couple of times. So it prevents both horizontal and geographic contagion of unrest. That's seen as one of the advantages of the model. And you're right that in the Solomons, it appears to be being kind of coupled, at least in some of the places where the training is being done, with this grid management approach that is the sort of organizational backbone of some of the surveillance state that China's constructed. So when you put together the sort of grassroots model of community or instability resolution with the technological tools and the organizational infrastructure of grid management, that starts to look much more like you're exporting sort of a model more wholesale. Now, the Global Times pushed back, right? And so if for folks who are interested in listening, there's a fairly entertaining rebuttal in the Global Times by about Western anxiety over the Feng Chao model. And really the question is this appropriate for the Solomons, right? And that's the sort of rejoinder that's raised in the Global Times is, well, it doesn't really matter if it's a Chinese solution. What really matters is, does it work for the Solomons? And their leaders think it does. So insecure Westerners buzz off is basically the tone of the piece. It's Global Times, but
right.
But it is interesting that they kind of, very explicitly had a rejoinder to the concerns raised about the externalization of the Feng Chao model.
So Bill, if I can just give you, I can give
please.
you just a couple numbers real quick on where specifically they went in the Solomon Islands. So this was it was reported in September of this year. It was People's Public Security University of China put out a press release on this, sort of writing about the personal testimonies of these police officers who went to the Solomon Islands. So they had a 6-month stretch where they went to 70 communities, over 20 schools, conducting 57 community policing activities. And these are going across provinces that have, very scattered archipelagos where, Solomon Islands is a country of, I want to say, I think almost 1 million or well over 1 million people. I can't remember the population, but spread across a very vast archipelago that's difficult to govern and have law enforcement officers on every single island. And so I think what we can partially intuit here is that the advocacy of the Feng Chao model as a model that works for Solomon Islands is one that is relatively less reliant on having to have an intensive police presence on every single island. It's having communities police themselves and neighbors tell on each other. And so we can see sort of spreading across, at least there's a few different provinces listed in here, but going well across the country and teaching it to many localities.
Yeah, and just to contextualize what I would think of as maybe an over interpretation of just how exportable something like the Feng Chao model is. I think this is another reinforcement of the idea that China does not attach any strings to this aid. There's no particular normative set of precepts that are guiding. What they have are tools, and what they have are some political and economic objectives. And so for the Solomons, that makes sense. I think they're very flexible. It's not the way they approach their security engagements in Pakistan or in Latin America, where they're dealing with very different environments. And I think that's the strength of it from as a business proposition. They're willing to meet you where you are from a security standpoint.
Interesting. So I had two last questions, and then one was kind of specific to the surveillance capacity. I know you referenced Min Xinpei and his foreign affairs article, and he had the I forget the name of his book that I think it was based on. But he talked State. Right, Sentinel State. Sorry, and he's very, very important work, and he has a lot of data in there about how many people are involved in the whole sort of surveillance apparatus. And so one of the questions, the idea would be, well, it's not going to work in other countries because China just has a lot more people, right? I mean, but where does AI fit in? Are Chinese AI models being incorporated in any of this? I mean, is this something where actually with better AI, the surveillance gets better and you don't actually need that many people? And so it might work in other countries? I mean, I'm sort of putting you on the spot, but it just seems like that might be plausible.
There's definitely discussion of how to use AI in policing and in law enforcement, and we see that in the agenda at the Global Public Security Cooperation Forum, and we see the use of technology to make policing more efficient in some of the training documents, and so there is clearly that discussion. One of the things I think that's really important and still really largely an unanswered question is, what is the effect of all of this going to be? What is the effect of a training program? One of the things we know is that sometimes Chinese police programs train a group of people from a country, and then they go back and train other people. And so there's kind of a secondary or second order effect. And we saw that in a number of the documents that describe training programs. So I think we really don't know, because this phenomenon is pretty new, and we didn't have the data on where it was happening and to what extent. So if you don't know where and when it's happening, it's hard to know what the effect is or be able to identify the effect systematically. And so again, that's, sorry to punt on this, but that's $1 million question we would love to have the answer to and are starting to do some work on now, because I think the effects probably are going to matter. They might be positive in some cases where you need just better governance quality and state capacity. But they might be really negative in other places. And I just don't think we know how these cross-cutting effects are going to add up. So it's one of the things I'm really excited about, hoping to look at in the future.
So Isaac, did you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's early days in this project. The United States has been at building security relationships overseas in a intensive way for much longer, and I think we're pretty early on the case of a couple of the indicators that we're just not accustomed to tracking, and we're really hoping that other researchers and the IC and the countries that are affected are going to pick this up. It's hard to know, and I think we've tried to be very modest about what we think we can show is the effect. We're looking a lot at inputs and the ways that China is giving tools for certain types of security activities, and building the political knowledge maybe for a more political form of policing or law enforcement. But it's hard to know in the absence of very detailed case studies. And I guess it's worth flagging now for your audience and to give ourselves a pat on the back. The Economist did a wonderful feature on our police training report, where they did actually do some of that field work and gave you a feel for what it's like to do hands-on, police training with your counterparts from the PRC. And countries are navigating an interesting new security environment. And as Sheena pointed out, we see them wanting to get the best from the US as well as the best from China. And I think that is an attractive space to be in right now at this particular moment. It's a little precarious, but it seems like there's something there for middle powers.
And it seems like a rational choice to try and pick from the,
Sure.
Pick a little bit from here, a little bit from there, and, get the best deal. One last question for me, which is, you sort of answered this, but, there's the long running debate. Is China exporting its model? I'm simplifying, or is China just trying to make the world safe for authoritarians? What does your research tell you in sort of moving towards an answer to that question? Simple question.
Let me take a first stab at this, which is that I would wholeheartedly endorse the idea that the intent is to make the world safe for authoritarians, or maybe even more narrowly, self-interestedly, to make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party. The question is, we did say export. It's a little easier to wrap your head around, and trade's really popular these days. But I would say externalize is a better word for it, because this is the effect of working with China in the security space. And we don't know. It's an emergent property of the way China does security, in the same way that our regional security system and alliances reflect something about the American view about global security. And it's way too early to know. We're going through across the Rubicon. I think we're on our way now, and we're finding out what it looks like, and we're hoping people will pile in and try and understand what China is actually doing, as opposed to what a lot of people in DC imagine they might be doing.
I think you can strengthen autocrats by providing tools or exporting tools without exporting specific Chinese style authoritarianism as a wholesale model. We certainly see that the Ministry of Public Security has talked about Safe China as an example. They don't tend to use the word model, but they tend to use the word example, or a story that the world can learn from. And there's certainly, if exporting just means making things available to foreign counterparts, they are exporting tools. They're not necessarily requiring that they all be packaged together. So many of these tools are being exported in a disaggregated fashion, which I think actually is a flexible, improvisational strategy that allows for ad hoc coalition building in a way that's probably very effective for China as a sort of newcomer to the global security space. I guess, though, with respect to your question, I have a slightly different take, which is that the way, and forgive me, but this is the sort of the book I'm trying to finish right now. So when Xi Jinping thinks about security, right, and he thinks about even regime security, and the party thinks about regime security, many of the things they think destabilize the regime internally still have external sources: foreign subversion, external infiltration, black hands of the West, or external suppression and containment. And so therefore, what you actually see is, even though the language is defensive, it's about protecting the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and China's socialist system, right? This concept of political security that's at the heart of Xi Jinping's comprehensive national security concept really is about political security. But protecting that requires that you be preventive, and that you take a preventive approach, and you go eradicate the sources of instability, which in many cases lay beyond China's borders.
Right.
So there is no way to sort of make the world safe for the CCP or its political system without at least partially reforming the global security order. And so I think that's why we've seen over time, when you really look at what's required to implement the comprehensive national security concept, if you take seriously what Xi Jinping says the sources of threat to that system are, you have to have a foreign policy component, and it actually has to be somewhat revisionist. And so I think you see it's a defensive end, but has to be pursued through assertive and revisionist means. And that's why that's a really hard sort of conversation and strategy, I think, for people to wrap their heads around. But that's my
no, it makes total sense to me. And it's, you have to shape your external environment to protect your domestic control, right? And I think that's a really good crystallization of, I think, certainly what I haven't done all this research, but my impressions from
now you don't have to
with all this stuff. No, well, I know the report's great, but honestly, I mean, the way you described it has a real logic to it that really, I think, makes a lot of sense.
And we should quit while we're ahead and give the last word. But I want to give Cameron the last word, but I just want to intermediate here. And I think Sheena said something really interesting before about what Xi Jinping thinks he's doing. And I've been thinking a lot about, what does Xi Jinping think about Xi Jinping thought, and particularly on comprehensive national security in the new era. What does he think he's actually accomplishing with this? And there's one theory of this, that he's not necessarily concerned with things, the externalization to it in the Solomons. That's just like a property of them politicizing and mobilizing their domestic security apparatus to do the stuff that he needs them to do. And there's not a lot of scope of control for the central leadership as to how this plays out. And we see a lot of that fragmentation in our data.
Well, just to be clear, I make no claim to know how Xi Jinping's actually.
No, I did. I was just being a political commissar and saying
analysis, but so I corrected myself and said when the party thinks, right? Because that, I think, is a little bit more knowable. I'm not trying to mind read Xi Jinping here, although it would be great if somebody could.
You had Joe Turigian on this show before, and I think he's doing as best as anyone can from outside of Zhongnan High. But before I give the last word to Cameron, I want to award him the Lei Feng Model Worker Award for the yeoman's work and the data for this, and he deserves the final word. Go ahead.
I'll give two last takes sort of on what it means with the export of the China model. I think that there's, depending on the context, many interpretations about just how much China is trying to export its model. I think that there's a number of interpretations for the reasoning behind foreign police training and trying to establish avenues of export of Chinese police tech. There's the excess capacity in the domestic security market interpretation. There is a transactional interpretation that China's overseas security assistance serves much the same role as BRI assistance of, earning United Nations votes or getting people to change their language on whether they oppose Taiwanese independence or if they do not take a stance on it, or if they endorse all means by which China re-annexes or tries to annex Taiwan. There's also interpretations of China seeking international leadership, that if China's model of public safety is one that is replicable, and if China can establish itself as a central actor in international institutions like Interpol, and ones that's standing up like its regional security platforms and the Lansang Mekong Cooperation and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that China then gets to establish itself as a leader in the international sphere by trying to sort of sidestep. And one thing that we're sort of working on together, another paper, is about China sidestepping the Western-led international order, where international security is defined through external state-to-state security, and redefining it in terms of internal security, where China has a comparative advantage in selling goods, practices, and models that are effective in achieving internal security. And then, of course, I think in terms of the security angle from Zhongnanhai, I think, if I look at, say, the Solomon Islands, or I look at Argentina, I would probably not say that China is as interested in having a strong, replicable model of security that's exported to protect themselves. But I would say that in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, in places that are directly close to Chinese national borders, I'm sure that they're a bit more gung-ho about the idea of having similar models of security implemented when you have the potential for transnational crime or transnational distancing groups, particularly in Central Asia. So depending on which angle you take in describing the context in which China is providing its aid, what sort of aid it's providing, it could be any of those interpretations.
Interesting. Well, I want to thank you all for spending an hour with us. This is a really important report, and I know you will continue to work on it and find more, but it's actually, I think, an issue that we all need to focus a lot more on, and it hasn't really been done to this granularity. So I just want to thank you all for doing this report. Last question, just anything you want to talk about? I should have asked you anything, or do you think we've covered most of it?
I think we've covered most of it. Thanks for having us. I'm a huge fan, and it's great to be part of the conversation. So we appreciate you having us today.
Great. Well, thank you, Sheena, Isaac, and Cameron. And thanks, everyone, for who tuned in. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Isaac. Okay.
No, I was just saying peace in the Caribbean.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone who tuned in. As I said at the beginning, this will also go out as a recording, both audio on your podcast feeds if you already have your Sinocism podcast, but also video. And again, thank you so much for your time. This is great. And hope everyone reads this report and look forward to future work. And I really look forward to your book, Sheena. No pressure,
Thanks.
but we're all looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Bill. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks,
Happy
everybody.
Thanksgiving. Yeah, thanks.
Happy
Bye-bye.
Thanksgiving.
Bye-bye.